right, everyone, we're at 4 minutes past, so let's get started because as business owners, if there's one thing we know, time is precious. So nice to meet you all. My name is Acacia Thornton, and today we are talking contracts, confidence, and crossing borders. Now, before I dive in, I want to ask everyone, have you ever been on a cruise? Has anyone in here been on a cruise? The first time I ever gave this talk, it was actually on a cruise. And so it was really cool. We started out of Vancouver, Canada. So I flew from Vegas up to Vancouver. I got to see that part of Canada for the first time. Loved it. Then we hop on board the ship and we went up to not one, but two stops in Alaska. So go from Canada back to the United States. It was an interesting feeling. And then we traveled all the way across the Pacific. And while we were on the Pacific, I was there speaking at a conference designed for entrepreneurs who were also digital nomads. So this very international business community. It was amazing. And as we went across, we end up in Japan with again two stops in another country. And this was really cool because the product here was our cruise, right? It's the boat. But then we get the service and these experiences across different countries. But those weren't the only things that were at play here. See, the company that owns that boat and operates that cruise is Holland America. They are based in Seattle, Washington. And the conference that I was attending, Nomad Cruise, they're out of Germany. So now we also have international companies involved. And then what about all those passengers? We had passengers covering every single major continent in the whole world. Passengers from everywhere. It was a really great experience, international community. But it made me wonder, if something goes down with the product, the services, or between some of the passengers, which country's laws are going to apply? What country are we going to follow? And we had a lot of choices, right? Canada, that's where we started. Alaska, we had two stops there. So we were in the United States twice as much as we were in Canada, but we were also in Japan twice. Then we have Germany, the company that hosts the conference, the boat owner and the cruise manufacturer, they're out of Washington. And then we have passengers from everywhere. So what if something goes down that has a little bit of everyone or different pieces? So I stopped and I thought, well, what law is everyone going to want? Right? If you're from Canada, you're probably not going to want Japanese law. And if you're from Japan, you're probably not going to want the state of Washington's laws. Everybody always wants what they know. They want what they're familiar with because the laws shape our culture, they shape our country's histories. They're part of where we come from and who we grow up as people. And so when we're subject to something that we're not fully fluent in, it can feel awkward and even unfair. But in this case, everything was everywhere. So who's going to get the feeling of being unfair? The company that owns the boat and the cruise? Is it the passengers? Is it the conference leaders? This simple question was an unknown. And as a lawyer, I'm trying to be on vacation. I don't want to sit there and be like, hey, let's research every one of these and figure it out. No, when we have a challenge or a question, we want guidance that we can get to easily and quickly. And to do that, it'd be nice if someone just told us what laws are going to apply here. Well, that product and service are owned and operated by Holland America. And so in their contract, when I purchased that cruise and when I checked in for it, I had to accept their terms and conditions. And their terms and conditions said the laws of the state of Washington apply. So even if something happened in international waters or over in Japan, up in Canada, even if something happened between a French citizen and somebody from South Africa, or it was regarding the German conference leader, things were going to happen under the laws of the state of Washington. When we leave these things open and unknown as your products and services cross borders, You leave yourself to being subject to all these different variabilities if you don't do something to declare and settle what is going to happen. The cost of crossing borders without the right paperwork is that you're going to end up with delayed payments. You're going to have uncollected revenue. You're actually going to lose or depreciate the value of your IP because even different countries have different approaches to IP. Of course, regulatory penalties are different. One country might have a way of doing things that you don't or that you're not familiar with. Customer disputes, as we just saw with the cruise, so many different places will be pulled because that's what they're comfortable with. It's not meant to be a fight or to say somebody's wrong. It's just we always want naturally what feels like home. But operational delays are massive as well. And if you think about it, a cruise ship didn't just have one cruise itinerary. That boat was probably made somewhere, and it's probably hit every continent that there is in a bunch more countries and has carried people from all over the world. So as your products and services go through your vendors, your suppliers, and become yours, they are subject to things. And as you transfer them across borders or where your clients are or where they change to, you also bring more availability and uncertainty into your business. And so, as the business owner, it's really important that you take charge of these things. And they're very easy. Some of the ones we're going to go through today, we're going to go through 4 key ones that you, as the business owner, you don't need an attorney, although there are times it might be helpful to have one. You don't need an attorney. We just need to be reminded, don't forget these things that are easy but make sense for your business. I'm also going to show you how international companies scale faster and easily using these. It's one of the fastest and low-cost ways to do it is by doing your contracts. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me, my name is Acacia Thornton, longtime attorney, business coach, and a revenue architect. I have spent nearly 20 years in this business. I started off in business consulting. I have a business degree, sales awards. I really understood the revenue generating side of a business. I'm also the daughter of a successful entrepreneur. And then I went to law school. And I went to law school to enhance and make stronger, better customer and business deals. That's why I went. So many lawyers go to law school and come out with like, you can't do this, fight, protect. And I'm like, nobody goes into business so they can fight and protect. They go into business to elevate success for both sides. And so because of that, I come with a very different approach to how I handle contracts for all of my clients. I also went on to become senior legal counsel at the global level for a Fortune 500, and I have covered every region of the globe for more than one company in my career. So like I said, we're going to go over 4 key things today. It's not everything. I do have a checklist available for all of you. It's free to download. And so if you want to get that checklist either now, get ahead of what we're going to talk about, or see some of the other things that we're not going to get to, know that that is available for you right here, right now. So let's dive in. Quick question. Is it illegal to breach a contract? Is it illegal to breach a contract? It's not in the United States. It's not in the United States. There are some countries out there where it is illegal to breach a contract. But this is an important kind of consideration as business owners that I think is one of the key things most business owners aren't even aware of. So I want to make sure you are. So on the back of that boat that I was telling you about, there was a Dutch flag. Everyone's like, well, Dutch law applies. But I'm like, but you have those terms and conditions that said the state of Washington, right? We did have that. What's the difference? Is there a conflict here? And the answer is no. There is a difference between crimes and contracts. Crimes are when the government prosecutes things like murder, things like stealing, things that go to the basic behaviors of how culture should behave. Oftentimes, the penalties are jail, fines, maybe community service, and they're meant to shape societal behavior. Contracts, however, it's the other party who is enforcing, not the government. So if you breach the contract, the government doesn't come along and say you're going to go to jail. Instead, the other party that you've contracted with comes in and says, this is how I'm harmed. This is what went wrong, and I want restitution for that. And usually that means the outcomes are monetary or stopping some type of action if you're doing something that, invades their privacy or intellectual property. And it comes down to enforceable promises between the parties. This is an important distinction for you as a business owner because this is your paperwork superpower. We call this contractual autonomy, and it is practiced in 99% of the world. United States, Europe, definitely on this list. What is it? Contractual autonomy says that the government lets you contract to what you want to contract to. The government doesn't say whether you need to let somebody have your products or services a certain way at a certain price and who's responsible for what. That's not the government's role. That's your job because you're the expert. You're the expert at your business. No one's going to know that better, not even the lawyer. And because of this, they let parties make their own promises on the piece of paper. They trust you to know what rights you need and what obligations you're willing to agree to. But that does also mean that we have a responsibility. If you don't put what you need and what you're expecting into this, you're not going to have what you need. The governments are not going to come in and save you. So it becomes both this opportunity, but then we have an obligation and responsibility to step into that. This matters because you have control of what terms and conditions your products and services are going across borders under. So let's look at some of those top mistakes that I've seen. One of the most common mistakes that I see business owners make is the idea of letting others choose your rules. As we just saw with the cruise thing, everyone's going to want what they want. And maybe if you already have a contract or terms of service you are using, vendors or customers, and you send it off to them and they redline and they change what's called your choice of law. Well, the choice of law specifies which jurisdiction's laws are applied. So if they're changing what you have there, your product and services are now subject to who knows how many jurisdictions. Because every one of the contracts your business is under, from vendors and suppliers down to your customers and your partners, they all have a law, hopefully have a law declared. And if not, you're subject to what we just saw on the cruise. So when we have this, it creates clarity, communication, and certainty for everyone. But most importantly, for you as a business leader, because you don't want to find out that what you use the word patent out of a contract out of the United States under your Nevada entity, and then find out that in Germany, a patent means something else. You want to know which country's laws and interpretations are being applied to your scenarios. So very simple concept, easy for you to decide. I'll show you what to do. Step one is you're going to decide. Pretty simple, right? Yeah, you want to decide, and you can choose what's best for protection for your business, your services, best for your product type. Maybe certain laws or certain jurisdictions are more favorable. And then, of course, if you're from a certain place and that's what's familiar to you, there's warmth and a feeling of safety there. So you can decide what you want. And I know a lot of you are balancing a Nevada entity or an American-based entity, US-based, with another entity abroad. So I just want to get ahead and say, yes, a Nevada LLC or any entity out of Nevada can use foreign law. So if the entity on the top of your contract is your Nevada entity, let's say, for example, I'm here. My company is here. So I could be like, oh, party one is me, party two is my customer, and it's under the laws of Poland. I can do that. That is permissible because of that contractual autonomy privilege. Now, one thing that is important to note is that United States is not an option. This is something I see a lot of business owners get wrong, and I've seen it particularly when they go to AI. I don't know why AI still does this, but let's say you're working with a foreign entity or customer abroad, and you say, hey, I want the laws of the United States to control. In the US, our contract laws are by state. So you don't say under the laws of the United States, you say under the laws of the state of Nevada or under the laws of the state of New York. So it's really important to know that if you put the laws of the United States as a literal on the document, it actually doesn't mean anything. You're still subject to the what's happening chaos. So once you've decided what laws, which country or jurisdictions laws you want to apply, you're going to declare it right on the document, just as we've been talking about. Here's some examples. This agreement shall be governed and interpreted by the laws of what you want. And as mentioned, in the United States, it's by state. So laws of the state of Nevada, the state of California. Majority of countries outside of the United States and outside of Canada, it is by country. It's by country. But it is important to list the country formally. So maybe the Republic of, or for example, England is not the laws of England, they are the laws of England and Wales. So we do want the formal, and you can kind of Google this, but we want to make sure that we are formalizing which country's laws, which jurisdiction is going to apply to your business. Now, I did mention contractual autonomy happens in 99% of the world. Yes, there's exceptions. It'd be kind of impossible for me to go through every single country in the world and write them all down, but the main commerce centers that do not practice full contractual autonomy are Brazil, China, and the Middle East. If you're doing business out of one of these, or you have customers in these areas or vendors in these areas, it's important to know you're going to be subject to their rules, their way of doing things, and you want to make sure you are in compliance. Otherwise, you don't have a valid contract. So when you allow multiple jurisdictions on your agreement, you subject your revenue, product, and company to unknowns. So by picking one jurisdiction, maybe two, that you're like, this is how we're going to do business. We're going to do business under the laws of the state of Nevada, or we're going to do business under the laws of Poland. You can securely build your compliance, build your structure, build your IP, knowing that you have these boundaries and guidelines that should things arise, you're going to be okay. All right. So that was the first mistake, choice of law. Now, I love this. Photo time! Yes. Okay. I love showing travel photos, and whenever I have international people, I'm like, I'm going to show you travel photos. All right. So this first one is a photo I took in Iceland. They have a drink there called crap. Yeah, love it. K-R-A-P, crap. And this is hilarious to me because growing up in the United States, crap means poop. I want like some slushy poop, please. It's funny to me. But that's not the way Iceland people see it. To them, it's a local brand. I lived in Latin America for 2 years, and Bimbo, excuse the horrible picture here, but Bimbo is a massive like bakery brand everywhere in Latin America, including out of Spain. But Bimbo, the English reading of this, that's an insult to somebody like me. Right? It means a stupid or dumb woman. Excuse me? Why would you celebrate a bakery brand called that? Are you calling me fat? You know, it's kind of this different words across different cultures have different meanings. And then this is a personal story. This is me and my mom. We were in Buenos Aires. I was living in Buenos Aires when they won the World Cup. So those of you that are big soccer fans, I got to experience what that was like from the American perspective. It was very amazing. And of course, Argentina's main soccer player is Messi. And so after they won, the news, jerseys everywhere. It's Messi this, Messi that. And my mom came in to celebrate my birthday with me about 2 weeks later. My mom's name is Missy, Missi. And after about a day or two, she like half jokingly, half exasperated, just goes, who is this Messi guy? And why is everyone talking about him? It's driving me nuts. I think they're saying my name. And of course I chuckle because I know what it is. But my mom is from small town Wisconsin. Why would she know soccer? Why would she know Argentina's soccer? She doesn't know that. So these cultural and verbal changes across boundaries started to come up as you travel more. Because this is mistake number 2, that assuming everyone means the same things. Just because we're using the same words does not actually mean we mean the same thing. Which we call this choice of language. And choice of language specifies which language will apply for controlling your contract, which words. It's not enough to just say, hey, the laws of Nevada. It doesn't mean American English. And it doesn't mean we're going to push out the other side's language. These are a different concept because language is about communication. So it avoids miscommunication. It's also going to create more predictability and quicker resolutions with the other side. Majority of the time, your contracts are never going to end up in court. You're probably not going to sue people. But sometimes questions arise. Sometimes we need direction. And we go to the terms of the contract to get that direction. So it's important that everyone understand what they mean. And this is the shocker for a lot of business people. We can't always rely on English, even if both sides speak it. Why? Because some choice of law countries decide your choice of language for you. We just got done talking about choice of law and why that's really important, determining which jurisdiction. Well, some jurisdictions limit which language you can use. An example is the laws of France. Last I checked, France will only allow contracts in French. So if you're using a French choice of law or you're a French entity with a choice of law, and let's say your customers are in England and the United States. Well, most Americans out of the United States do not speak French. And English, they might have that dual language thing, but they're not going to be as easy to find as if you had something in English. And of course, a lot of people in France do speak English, but the laws of France say your contracts must be in French or they're not enforceable. So choice of law plus language means some choice of law countries decide it for you, even if it's bad for business. So what do you do? What do you do if, hey, I want Polish, and I do not know what the language limitations or opportunities are out of Polish law, but it might require things being Polish. But you're here in Nevada trying to make an entity in business here. What kind of influence? How do we solve this problem quickly and easily? Here's how you do it. 3 steps to choice of law. First, you want to confirm what your choices are. Usually a Google search or an AI search. Hey, if I choose this as my choice of law, what languages can my contract and terms legally be in? Of course, double check these things and verify, but we don't have to hire an attorney majority of the time. And then you're going to decide. Decide what you need for your choice of law. And then decide what's ideal for your customers. What, Acacia? Yes. So let's say we're back to that thing where you're under the laws of France, where you got to have French. You've got these clients and potential business out of English-speaking countries. We're going to use what's called a dual language agreement. This is how you do what's best for your business while also getting to keep the choice of law you feel the most comfortable proceeding in. It's called a dual language agreement, and it looks like this. As you can see, one side is in English and one side is in French. And ideally, these are going to be line for line accurate. So if it takes 3 words in French to say what you can say in 1 line in English or 1 word in English, we want to make sure they are literally aligned. You used to have to hire specialty companies to do this. One of the reasons for that is something like a patent, right? We can't just use the word in the other language, or there's legal concepts. A concept we have here in the United States is called indemnity or indemnification. Other countries probably have the same concept, but don't use that word, because I think we got that word, ironically enough, from the French. So we want to make sure that it's not just a straight translation, but it is a communicative one based on the language opportunities and limitations. And you can put one on one side, one on the other, and this increases your customer base. Because now you can get double the amount of customers by having 2 languages on one document. So it's an opportunity to make sure you're compliant with your choice of law. That way you get that choice first, doing business under the laws you want, but getting to communicate your business with your clients the way you want, okay? So the main takeaway here is that English is the language of business, but it is not always the language of contracts. All right. I promised I would show you all the secret about how these big companies scale internationally. And here's the secret. I have drafted, negotiated, and closed deals for multiple international companies. I have closed deals and represented entities across the globe. Some of them hundreds of times. Truly I think every region, except I have not negotiated with the penguins of Antarctica. Still on my to-do list. But it is not reasonable for me to be licensed in every one of these regions, let alone truly familiar with every one of these regions or countries' laws. That would take a lot of time and money for every business to go through and customize every time they were trying to do this or go into another country. So I am licensed out of Illinois. I have one licensure. So how is it that I've done this? Here's how. We talked about choice of law. We've talked about choice of law. So if the companies I have been representing have a choice of law with contractual autonomy, meaning that what's in the contract can be independent of what's going on with the laws, I only have to be very familiar with the laws of one or two places based on that choice of law and what's in that contract. That's all I need to be successful. Because even if, let's say that it was under the laws of New York, even if the other side is in France, I don't need to know French law because French law is not what's going to control this. I need to know what's on the paper, and I need to know the laws of which is going to be applied and interpreted. And what we usually do, if you're a really big company, is you might have a backup in a different region of the world. So some of the bigger companies I worked with, they might have one out of the United States, because the United States laws are on average, better for certain types of intellectual property and consumerism, right? Business, but not always. So we would then offer a second one. And how does this play out? Let's say, oh, and that's the other thing. I also only need to know one language, because English is an acceptable choice of law language for both the United States, the states individually, but also out of England and Wales. So I don't need to speak French. As long as I have that dual language contract, even if the other side doesn't speak English, I can negotiate the English side and then make sure the French side represents and reflects that. So in practice, what does this look like? Let's say we were a Nevada-based company, we're using Nevada law, and we have a potential customer out of Canada. And they would be like, we would like the laws of Quebec. That's nice, but we only do business under the law that we chose. This example has New York, but for you, that might be Nevada. And then that's it. We don't suddenly let our stuff become subject to the laws of Canada and Quebec. We keep it based where we want it to because that's what's best for our business. And let's say we had a potential customer in South Africa. Same thing. Hey, New York law, or Nevada law. But if you're not comfortable, because it is true, there are sometimes entities and cultures on the other side that do not want to be subject to a US-based law. We gave them the opportunity of, like, if you don't want the US choice, you can choose the laws of England and Wales. Right? So do we see how this kind of works? This gives us that opportunity to be grounded and safe. We don't have to learn everybody's laws. We only have to know one language. This one we chose English, and that is it. And it simplifies things as we move across, because should anything occur, as we're going to get into with these other areas, is that, well, we know exactly where to start and how to get our answers. Oh, there's just that, repeating it, because smart scaling is about simplification for greater growth, not just repeating the same thing over and over again as you go to a different country. Now, I saw a chat question come in. I cannot see my chat at this moment. I don't know where it went, but I promise that I will get to it at the end of this, okay? If I don't answer it before that. Mistake number 3. Common sense isn't always so common. I'm going to tell you a story about Zariah. So there was an entity, they were actually out of Europe, and they had this employee, Zariah. Zariah had been working with them for years, but Zariah was like, hey, I want to go back to my homeland. My homeland was Russia. Can I do that? And the company out of Europe said, we have to check with our supplier. We're licensing their product. We have to make sure they're okay with it going to Russia and get an exception on the contract. So that's what they did. They reached out to their vendor. Their vendor said, sure, not a problem. Let's write up an addendum. They get permission to let Zariah become a freelancer out of Russia instead of an employee. And this made everyone happy. The company didn't lose one of their best employees. Zariah got to go home to Russia, and the vendor was satisfied knowing that they had had the chance to vet the opportunity of their product going somewhere else, and everything was done on paper. Beautiful. Well, suddenly the vendor comes along about 4 months later and says, you got to cut Zariah off now. And the company was like, excuse us? You just gave us permission. We went through this whole thing. We did this right. We let her go back to Russia and become a freelancer instead of an employee because you gave us permission. And the vendor goes, we don't care. I'm cutting you off. The company is like, this is a breach of contract. You don't have the right to just cut us off. We have this in writing. And now you're saying we have to change how we work with Zariah, maybe cut her loose entirely because you're changing your mind? This sometimes happens across borders. Because what happened in this scenario is I was actually representing the vendor. I was their in-house counsel. And shortly after giving that exception for Zariah to go to her homeland, Russia invaded something. They invaded something, and the United States government put sanctions, saying if you do anything, if you ever have any direct or indirect benefit out of any contracts or business with or through the country of Russia, you must cut it off immediately or you are subject to federal penalties. And when we're talking sanctions out of the United States, you don't mess with them. Especially because the company I worked for was on the S&P 500. They were publicly traded. Our parent company was also out of the United States. And even though the entity we had used was one of our European entities, so we had our European entity do this license with a European customer, because that European entity had a parent company out of the United States, we were forced to sever all of this or risk sanctions. But here's the challenge. Just because you're required to do something does not mean you have the contractual right to do it. This goes back to the idea of contractual autonomy. We had a contract with that customer as their vendor saying for the next 5 years, you're going to have access to this product at these rates. And we had given them permission on paper to let Zariah have access. So if we don't have the contractual right, something literally stated explicitly in that contract that we can terminate or shift things in the event of a change in laws or sanctions like this, we would be stuck between a rock and a hard place. We'd be having to choose between breaching the contract or breaching federal law and risking all of our entities through the parent entity out of the United States. Those are some harsh consequences on either side. Thankfully, this contract had been set up for success internationally, and we knew this, and we had added terms to that effect. If you have a contract you've been using for customers or vendors, and it's not intentionally designed for international transactions, it may not have these rights included because they're not considered normal in like a Nevada to a New York type transaction. So some of the things that we know for sure happen that you're going to be stuck between that rock and that hard place is global affairs. Governments, leaders, sanctions, wars, imports, and export laws. The United States is considered one of the most stable when it comes to currency, government, and business. And yet, our federal administration changes every 4 to 8 years. Every 4 to 8 years, things have the opportunity to change massively. And yet that's considered one of the most stable countries. So if you have contracts that are more than 1 year long, odds are you're going to hit one of these on either side. Same with like if Russia had done something, you got to cut off anything with out of a European entity, Zariah would have been forced to cut her employer off, and so on. So being mindful that when we cross borders, we add these other elements of, we'll have to see sort of government enforceability. And if we don't give ourselves the explicit right to maneuver under them, we become in breach of contract, and the other side does have the right to sue you for it, even though it really didn't feel like a choice. And that is because what is reasonable isn't always excusable. It was very reasonable for us to want to go in and cut off Zariah's access, but under the contract, if the terms weren't there, it would not have been excusable. We would have pissed off a customer, and we would have been at risk of a breach of contract. Another way this comes up is the idea of what changes just for you, especially if you're a small business owner or a solopreneur. But this definitely happens at a different level as you scale. So I'll give you an example. One of my clients, I have a lot of designer clients, and she's a single mom. She's got a kid, and she was up against a deadline designing some marketing materials for an upcoming conference. One of her clients was going to the conference. They need to make the banners and all the signs and the tablecloths, all that stuff. So she's doing this work for them. And then about a day before her deadline, she's on track, but just maybe a little behind. We've all been there. Her kid falls out of a tree, breaks his arm, ends up in the hospital. And he ends up spending the night in the hospital needing surgery. She is not going to abandon her child, right? That's not what she's going to do. She's going to be the mother. She's going to step up. She's going to be there, but at the risk of missing a deadline. And then the deadline comes and goes. As soon as her kid's good, she gets on there and she gets the things to her client maybe a day or two late. Now she tells them, hey, this is what's happened. It's a day or two late. But here was the problem. She might have had a reason, a justifiable reason for being late, but her client has deadlines too. And they now missed one of their deadlines because her stuff was late. And now, in order to get everything printed and ready in time for the conference, there's going to be a $2,000 rush fee for the printing and rush fee for the shipping. Ouch. Who's responsible for this? Because neither party did anything wrong, but one of them suffered harm. This comes up a lot in international contracts, and the concept is called force majeure, another French term. And it is a different phrasing in different countries, by the way, but it has lovingly been called the acts of God clause. It feels legal, but it's actually an economic and cultural thing. Let's go through a nice list of examples. And we call it the acts of God clause because it's things that are out of your control. Things you can't control, but they happen. But if they happen to your vendors and suppliers, they impact your business, which might impact your customer's business. They happen to you. They might impact downstream stuff. They might impact your ability to pay your bills. When these types of things outside of our control happen, if we don't have a contract that speaks to them and makes sure you can pivot and do what you need, you're in breach of contract. And that's what happened with the designer. She missed the deadline. The deadline was part of the contract. She's in breach of contract. But no way I think anybody thinks she did something wrong by being there for her child. So what are some of the common ones? Pandemics. Did you know that before the whole COVID-19 crisis, that the word pandemic and endemics was rarely part of agreements anymore? In fact, there was this whole thing where we took them out because we're like, that doesn't apply anymore. Well, guess what? A number of countries, customers, and vendors, their entire supply chain and vertical were messed up because different states in the United States closed down at different times in different ways. Europe closed down first, then Australia, and we had this whole different sort of rolling effect. So many of us were in a different place of what we could legally do versus those of what we couldn't do. This meant that while you're in business and your customers are in business, maybe your suppliers aren't. Or vice versa. Maybe your customers are in business, but you're not. You're in breach of contract. And this really hurts. And we saw a lot of lawsuits come out of that because nobody was willing to foresee that. We now know that that is possible again. We thought with a lot of vaccines it had gone to the wayside. Same with worker strikes. In the United States, worker strikes are not considered acts of God or out of someone's control. They are mostly removed from contracts now. Why? Because of unions and contract negotiations, we now consider that you have the ability to foresee a worker strike coming, and it's your responsibility to make sure things can run during it. However, out of Canada, out of Latin America, that's not the way things work. There might literally just be out of nowhere a worker strike or a riot of some sort. That is more like an act of God, something completely out of your control. So if we're not addressing and accounting for these things in the contract, you're still legally responsible for the contractual autonomy promises and obligations made. Other things are religious and cultural events. I worked for somebody who was out of London. Well, the Queen, God rest her soul, she passed away, and then the King was coronated. He's suddenly out of office, and I'm like, excuse me, I'm working. On the flip side, I would get Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving off, and he wouldn't. Currency crisis. Check how you're listing your currencies. If those currencies are not clear or we need to have any type of exchange rate listed in there, we want to make sure it's set. Because during the term of your contract, one side might shift dramatically, leading to a higher cost or a lower margin than you anticipated. Transportation blockades, infrastructure failures. If you've ever been somewhere and the power goes out or the internet goes out, civil unrest, government shifts, hurricanes, earthquakes, airport shutdown, all these types of things. It is normal for these things to happen in life, and it is normal that they affect your business. But if we don't realize that they could be happening in one place without them happening in the other areas of your vertical, they can negatively impact your revenue and your ability to lead as a business. Force majeure usually counts for both sides. So when we list it into a contract, 90% of the time, it applies to both sides. Both sides are excused in the event that there's a currency crisis. Both sides are excused if this or that. But sometimes you want to add nuances to those. And every now and then you do want to separate the lists based on where you are. What is an act of God in the United States is not necessarily an act of God out of another country, and vice versa. So that's the mistake number 3, is not planning for the countries to change around you. They're going to. It's normal. It's part of global society to have these opportunities, but they also come with these obligations and these risks that we want to account for, so that when you pick your choice of law and you pick the terms that you're going to have in your agreements, that there is success and everyone has what they need if they happen. You don't want to be caught off guard and stuck with a bunch of unexpected expenses, or worse, you end up having sort of a fallout of having to breach other contracts because you didn't set up your upstream contracts for success when they were abroad or somewhere else. So contracts and confidence, today's topic, when we're crossing borders, means understanding a very simple concept. What happens to your suppliers and your customers happens to your business, even if you are geographically in one place, even if your product or services are from one place, even if your entity, your legal entity you're using is in one place. With contractual autonomy, we have a responsibility to account for all the various layers that come into play. And those layers are recognizing that language isn't always enough, particularly English. Countries' laws vary, and we want to make sure we have what's going to be a success for you. The government, as we saw with sanctions and things like that, as new administrations come in, as there is civil unrest or riots or somebody gets out of office in another country, this opens things up to shifting and changing. What felt normal and predictable one day is suddenly feeling like chaos because you don't know how it's impacting your business if we haven't set the contracts up. And as we saw, culture also affects all of these things. What feels normal and the same is not normal and the same across both lines in language and what is considered common sense and so on. All right. So being on the same page requires that the pages align to your way of doing business. Again, I got that full checklist for you. We really only covered kind of 3 to 4 topics today. I've got the full checklist. There's at least 10 on there. It grows every now and then. If you want to grab that, my name is Acacia Thornton. I am the CEO Legal Coach. So my website is ceolegalcoach.com. So I have a lot of my programs, templates, and so on in case you have any questions about that. I am available via email. And of course, the best place to follow me is usually LinkedIn because that's where most of my activities are on a day-to-day basis. Whew! That was a lot, wasn't it? I know that was a lot. Let me see if I can get into the chat really quick because I knew that came through. What do we have here? The US has some complicated tax systems. How much should we worry about US tax when drawing up or signing a contract? Have you come across a time when that negatively affected a contract? So taxes are one of the few things that it is by the government that we're crossing borders, import and export. And then you will also have the taxes you're subject to as the legal entity. So that is one of the few things that, because that's not part of the contract, that is part of the rules. So we talked today about contractual autonomy. What we didn't really get to is the idea of import and export taxes and tariffs. Every country is going to have those themselves, but as we saw, it is something that's subject to change. So being mindful of where your entity is and what laws you're under, and then how does that relate to where you're sending your products? Yes, Canada, Europe, the EU, and the United States have a different approach to this, particularly if and when sales tax is required, or VAT, as some of the other countries call it. So that is something that you are going to need to individually know. You don't get to contract out of paying taxes. The only thing that you might have on the contract is who is responsible for which taxes and which import fees. So if you're sending something to Europe, are you required to pay the shipping and the import and the export fees? Or is the customer required to? So whether or not it exists is by the countries individually, but who is responsible for them is something that you can contract to. Majority of the time. Yeah, great question. Hi, Acacia. Thank you for the informative session. You're very welcome. If you're the smaller company, what are the biggest red flags to look out for before signing an international contract? Oh, this is a great question. If something goes wrong, anywhere, hey, let's say, I'll give you an example. I had a client that one of their customers, so they license data, and then their customer has it, and their customer sub-licenses it to their customers. Well, somebody down the line ended up having a password share or breaching the contract in like a very minor way. It wasn't even a real breach because it wasn't a data breach. It wasn't a misuse of the data. It wasn't, anything, it wasn't a security risk. It just, there was that. So they send that to their vendor because the contract said they had to. And then our contract said, if that happens, you have to tell us. So they tell us. Well, some of our vendors, right? Some of that is ours and some of it comes from our vendors. Well, some of those vendor contracts said we had to tell them. And they decided, hey, you've got to go do credit reporting. Hey, you've got to send a notice out to everybody. Hey, you've got to get an audit report by a certain type of auditor and all this. It wasn't us. It wasn't even our customer. It was a sub-customer. So there end up being all these like blocks and barriers and obligations all the way down the vertical, but responsibilities all the way back up. This is a lot of costs. Our vendors were requiring us to do this. We didn't do this. We're not at fault for this. We had no control over this. We didn't see this coming. So who's going to cover our costs? Usually the bigger companies, back to your question, what are the biggest red flags to look out for? Is they're going to push all of their costs onto you. They're going to give themselves the most ability to terminate, to pivot along the things we talked about today, right? They're going to want their choice of law. They're going to want their language isn't as big of a deal, but their force majeure, they're going to want that. They're going to want you to cover their import and export fees. They're going to want you to cover if something goes wrong, you're responsible to cover all of their costs. Even if they get sued for something that is related to their contract with you, you can be responsible for paying for hiring their attorneys, for paying for their attorneys, for paying for everything all the way through. So the biggest thing that bigger established companies do, which by the way, you can use this to your advantage, is reducing how many expenses you have to pay if the world should fall and everything falls apart in the business. How much of it is your responsibility to have the cash on hand? What we do a lot is we look at what is your insurance, and we go a little below that. And that way, worst case, you're out your insurance deductible. But the other side is going to be responsible for everything else. So if you're not reading the terms of the contract, odds are that's probably the number one way they're taking advantage of you, is that they can do what's right for them, not right what's right for you, and that you're on the hook for their costs. What are the biggest mistakes startups make when signing their first international contract? The first one is just really being, and I'm sorry that I'm going to use a word that's so charged, and I don't mean it this way, so please give me the opportunity to explain it. But the idea of being ignorant. We assume it's the same. We assume I know my business, I know the deal, therefore I know enough. And by choosing, it's not by choosing, because we don't know what we don't know. Right. And that's fair for everyone. And so when I use the word ignorant, that's what I mean. Like we literally don't know. How could you know if you've not been through it before? So the biggest thing I like to ask and recommend smaller or newer business owners or those that are starting to scale across borders is appreciate that it is something new and different. And that means there's going to be unknowns, and open yourself up to learning them, talking with a coach. I don't just do attorney work. I'm also a business coach and contracts coach. And what that means is I help my clients understand how to do these deals better themselves. I coach them to success. I don't have to be their attorney or have legal fees. I don't have to represent them. I can guide and coach them to success. So appreciating it's not your first time and that there might be something you're not seeing or aware of, and allowing yourself to use it as a learning opportunity. Because every business at some point, and I mean every business, will hit a really harsh lesson. And that lesson is going to come out of a business deal. If you have the paperwork structured correctly, no matter what type of deal it is, that pain can either be avoided or mitigated. But if you go into it blindly, you're going to get blindsided at some point. So I would say that is the biggest thing. It's just becoming aware of what's possible. Which, like I said, we have contractual autonomy. You get a lot of power. It's a superpower. If you know how to structure that, you can really set yourself up for success. And something as simple as knowing how to pick a choice of law, that right there is already going to do you so much better than if you had just signed a contract that was sent to you. Mm-hmm. What red flags an international contract clause to walk away from a deal? This is hard because majority of the time it's not a one-liner or one section in a clause. A lot of times people don't understand, and AI doesn't understand this either, that there's sort of triggering or moving points, almost like a chessboard within a contract. So, for example, I'll play warranties against indemnification. I will play within a indemnification concept the idea of when are costs due, what costs, to what extent, and when. So if you're a small business, for example, you probably don't have millions of dollars on hand to just spend. You might have to go, if you want to scale, you might have to get a loan or something. But what if there's a lawsuit? So rather than you having to be responsible for all the costs of your litigation or a contract suit or costs like I talked about with that breach of contract and our vendors thing, rather than you being responsible for that, let's set you up for success in the contract where somebody else has to pay for those up front. And then if you are responsible or you are liable or there's some part of it that does belong to you, that part comes later in the process. Even though the idea of warranties and indemnifications feel the same across all your contracts, we can play with them to set you up for success based on where you are in your business. Like I said, insurance, cash on hand. I would rather somebody else pay for all of my litigation fees And then at the end of the court case, if I was liable, okay, now I've had a lot of time to plan for that. Now I've had a lot of time to get my hands on that money or save that money. But if something just lands on my plate right now, I'd be like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I'm going to have to choose and make decisions differently. So I would say the biggest red flags in the international contracts is not understanding the way that the board plays together and what that means for you if something goes wrong, so that you're just set up for success based on wherever you are in your business. There are businesses out there that have $1 to $2 million on hand. There are businesses out there that have $10 million in insurance. But if you're a 6 or 7 figure business, that's probably not where you are. Yeah. John, you are very welcome. Again, all of you, my name is Acacia Thornton, CEO Legal Coach. Paulina's going to record this. Well, she has recorded it and send it out to all of you. So if you have any questions, have any follow-ups, I look forward to hearing from every single one of you. Thank you for giving me your time. I appreciate and love you all. Have a great day.